Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show on Near FM. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com, and his new book, Peace After the Final Battle, is available now. If you'd like to listen to this or any previous episodes of the show, you can go to the Near FM podcast page on nearfm.ie/podcast, or check out our Facebook page on facebook.com/The Irish History Show. We're on Twitter, on twitter.com/IrishHistoryPod, and you can also email us at history@near.ie. The 26th of July 2014 will be the 100th anniversary of the landing of guns for the Irish Volunteers in Howth aboard the Asgard yacht. To discuss this, we're very pleased to be joined by historian and journalist Pádraig Yeates. Pádraig is author of Lockout, Dublin 1913, A City in Wartime, A City in Turmoil, and his forthcoming book, A City in Revolution, is due out next year. Pádraig, you're very welcome to the show.
Thanks, Carl.
Before we deal with the events in Howth on that day, could you explain to us what the volunteer movements were, and why were people importing arms into Ireland?
Well, it began in the north. The north began, as Owen McNeill said in a famous article, but basically the Unionists in Ulster were determined to resist Home Rule, if necessary, by all means possible, including physical force. The Liberal government, as part of the normalisation process, if you like, of the period, had lifted the embargo on imports of arms, which was very convenient for the Ulster Volunteers, who were then formed. In early 1913, this body of men, about 100,000 strong, their leadership organised the importation of about 11,000 rifles through Larne and about 2 million rounds of ammunition at night time, with the connivance of some of the authorities, but nevertheless it was done surreptitiously. And suddenly they had this large armed force. The Irish Volunteers were really playing catch-up by deciding that they were going to arm as well. Why were they going to arm? Well, because there was this fear that with the Unionists showing so much determination to stop Home Rule, the British government would concede that it wasn't possible, or at the very most would only allow it in what became the Irish Free State, the 26 counties in the south of the country. So there was an imperative, if you like, amongst the leadership of the Volunteers to do something about that. The people who founded it were militant nationalists. Several of them were key figures in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they were not only using the Volunteers to put pressure on the British government, but using the Volunteers to put pressure on John Redmond and constitutional nationalism. So that was the thinking behind it. It was only possible, though, because you had people like Alice Stopford Green and Erskine Childers and Thomas Mayos, who were members, who were liberal, well-to-do liberal-minded people, who sympathised with the Irish cause and had the money and the resources to buy the guns and then to ship them to Ireland. So in a way, they were not your classic profile of Irish revolutionaries at all, who couldn't have afforded to put two pennies together.
Pádraig, you've talked very well there about how the Unionists blocking Home Rule provided the context to the arming of the Irish Volunteers in the south. What about the Kerr Mutiny? Didn't this encourage nationalists to defy the law, or to feel that the law was no longer impartial in Ireland?
You're absolutely right, John. It did. That came in March of 1914, and cavalry officers under General Garfield de Curra were given the option of not moving against Ulster, because a lot of them would have had family connections there, which is an extraordinary thing to happen, because, again, looking at it in an Irish and a British context, there had been huge industrial unrest over the previous 4 years. In Ireland we had the Lockout, but you had huge strikes in Britain, and in fact I think the Royal Dublin Fusiliers were deployed in the rare strike against strikers outside London, around Ilford or somewhere. So the army had been routinely used to smash strikes or protect strike breakers in Britain, had been used to a lesser extent here to do the same thing. So for a lot of people on the left, as well as for nationalists, the idea that officers could pick and choose, but ordinary soldiers couldn't, outraged quite a lot of people. Tom Mann, who was a leading British trade unionist, was locked up for publishing a leaflet calling on soldiers in the Liverpool general strike not to strike break. So it seemed very much there was one rule for unionists and officers, and there was another rule for everybody else. So yes, you're absolutely right, John. That did fuel the anger that people felt about this.
And some historians, like Charles Townsend, has made the point that it wasn't actually a mutiny because they didn't actually disobey orders. But not only were they given the option, if they had family in Ulster, of basically going on holiday, But the remainder of the officers said that they would resign, or many of them, or I think around 50 or 60, said they would resign their commissions if they were ordered to go to Ulster to preserve public order, which seems like an extraordinary thing for an army officer to do.
Yeah, no, you're right. Again, it just underlines that class division that existed in society. The women's movement was something like that as well, where you had this huge struggle to get the vote. And we tend to forget now, but we think of what the crisis the Liberal government faced in 1914 as about Home Rule. But they had this huge problem, mass protests by militant suffragettes, and you also then had the Labour problem. So the British regime, if you like, the British establishment was under ferocious pressure from all sorts of directions, which does seem to have incapacitated them to some extent. And you had key politicians like Lloyd George and Winston Churchill basically parleying with the Unionists and saying basically, yeah, we really do support the idea of partition. Let just the South have Home Rule, which of course at the time flew in the face of the whole concept of one nation. The whole point of having Home Rule was to assert Irish nationality. So people in those days were conditioned to partition now, but people in those days, it was like saying, you can go out and leave home and go out and do your own thing, but you're going to have to chop off a leg or an arm first and leave that here. So people did feel very, very angry at the very notion of partition.
Well, was that a very real issue going back to 1912, 1913, or does it really become more pronounced as we get into 1915, 1916? Was it still being discussed at that stage, at that early stage, around the time that the gun runnings were happening?
The partition issue? No, it was, yeah. In fact, I think there is an argument that the Lockout sort of took a lot of the nationalist attention, the constitutional nationalist attention, off the issue, off the ball, as it were, in 1913, particularly John Dillon and Redmond, who were very upset about the split it was causing in nationalist ranks. And you've got to remember that they were intensely conservative people. They were rural radicals. These were men who had fought the land war. And for them, the land of Ireland, for the people of Ireland, or the farmers of Ireland at least, had been a key issue. And now Home Rule was a natural progression from that. So they understood that. When they saw people like Jim Larkin, for example, causing trouble, that was splitting the Unionist ranks. And the same with female suffrage. And as we know, John Redmond refused to endorse the idea of women having a vote in the Irish Parliament, although ironically enough, the Ulster Unionists didn't. They were quite willing to let women have the vote.
One more thing to add to that is that, well, first of all, the radical Irish nationalists in the IRB, and we know this from their newspaper, Irish Freedom, at first, in the 1910, 1911, they tended to believe that the Unionists wouldn't resist Home Rule, that they were just bluffing. But then, towards 1912, 1913, you do see them becoming very, very up in arms about this, and they say the classic Republican line that, Belfast is as much a part of Ireland as Clare and Kerry. So it was certainly, it was a huge issue. Now, of course, for the more radical Irish nationalists, it was a great stick to beat John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party, saying, look at the latest surrender kind of thing.
Well, there does seem to be a certain amount of admiration for Carson and how the Unionists in the North were willing to arm in defiance of the British government from nationalists.
Oh, absolutely. Owen McNeill, when he wrote that article for Gaelic League, The North Began, was praising them. And in fact, one of the very first meetings they had after the founding meeting in the Rotunda Rink in Dublin was in Cork. And the platform was attacked by constitutional nationalists, including Hibernians, because he started praising the Ulster Unionists and saying we should emulate them, and he enraged this very traditional Catholic nationalist audience. So a lot of people didn't actually understand that. And obviously Redmond was very suspicious of it. He didn't want the volunteers, and that showed in the reaction of many of his followers. So there's a lot of antagonism towards the volunteers, but it fitted the mood of the times. It was on the eve of the First World War, it wasn't just in Ireland or Britain, but across Europe, there were, new forces which were challenging the establishment. Most of them were nationalist forces. And at the time, the big empires, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they were seen as the prisons of the nations, and they wanted to smash these empires and replace them with nation states. So Ireland was part of that huge movement, and I suppose people should be careful what they wish for. But I mean, everything really, every war that has happened in Europe since then, including what's happening in the Ukraine now, we can really trace to the outbreak of war in July, August 14.
I think one of the things we might look at is the role of militarism in that pre-war period. That it seems bizarre, almost disgusting now to look at reports where people glorifying war in and of itself, and the role in youth organisations in promoting patriotism, physical fitness, and looking on for a career in the army. But back then it would have been considered almost normal, wouldn't it?
Well, it depends what you mean by a career in the army. If you're a middle-class person or upper-class person, a career in the army was a career as an officer and a gentleman. But basically, up until the outbreak of war, the only people who joined the British Army were the riffraff. They were the unskilled. They were people who couldn't get another job, or facing prison term, and you were offered the option. So it was not in Britain a very laudable thing. But there was, you're absolutely right, there was this love affair with militarism, with the glorification of war. You've got to remember there hadn't been a major war in Western Europe since the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. They'd been fighting in the Balkans, all right, but the Balkans in those days was as far away as China maybe is to us today. It was just a foreign, distant place nobody really knew about. So they'd been fighting in places like that. But in Europe as a whole, there had been no serious conflict. So people had no conception of what wars were about. And you had also this identification, which goes back to the Napoleonic Wars, really, of citizenship with bearing arms. The French levy en masse to throw out the invaders, followed by the great German Freikorps movement to throw the French out of Germany. So there was this long tradition that if you're a real citizen, a real patriot of your country, you have both a right and a duty to perform by bearing arms. So in Europe, you had conscription. In Britain, you had the territorials, and you also had volunteer companies. So what was happening in Ireland, and there was a National Guard formation in Ireland as well, very small as far as we know, but at the time that had been formed. So people did enjoy going out, go on a route march, maybe even camp over the weekend somewhere, have a few pints and come home again. And that was their concept of warfare, and that really remained the Irish volunteer concept of warfare right through to 1923, which was very different from what emerged in Europe, which was industrialised mass slaughter. But that was ahead of everybody.
I mean, it seems to me that the idea, I firmly back up what Pádraig has said about a long period of peace followed by, what can I say, a misleading or a naive idea of what war was about, was kind of a hegemonic idea at the time, in the sense that everybody had it, whether you were for a particular system or not. Like for the Irish nationalists, militarism was a really part of their thinking. For the Irish Republicans, that an Irishman without a rifle is not a man, for example. Pádraig Pearse famously welcoming the First World War in and of itself, because it would ennoble the generation of young men and so forth. And of course, again, and the Ulster Unionists were part of this as well. And one more thing I'd just like to add, which strikes me, is that volunteering was a relatively recent idea in Britain itself, because during the Boer War they'd raised a volunteer corps which they called the Imperial Yeomanry, to go off to fight in South Africa. So, like, the Irish volunteers were doing something that was almost mainstream at the time, in a way that it wouldn't be today.
Now, if you look at the landing of the guns itself, can you talk us through how that actually came about?
Basically, Alice Stopford Green, I think, put up the money, and Roger Casement was a key figure because he was a former diplomat. He had connections abroad. The Germans had already supplied. I know they're private companies, but obviously they were doing it with at least the sanction of their governments. They already supplied the Ulster Unionists with arms, Italian rifles. So these Mausers were quite old. They were black powder weapons. They were obsolete, really, in modern military terms. But there were a lot of them. They were very cheap. They were loaded in Hamburg. 2 ships brought them over. Erskine Schroeder's famously in the Asgard took the bulk of them from the Chota. They switched the guns in the Irish Sea off coastal Wales. The Asgard, the bigger vessel, took 900, and the Kelpie, Thomas Miles' vessel, took 600. The main consignment, the Asgard, came into Howth, and Darrell Figgis, Ned Daly, a few more key figures in the volunteers, organised this route march, and it was unusual in that every battalion was asked to turn out, and they all turned out that morning about 9:30 in Father Matthew Park, which was in Fairview. It's built on now, it's part of the Marino. They all marched out to Howth. And as they approached the village, as they marched into it, some of the men saw this yacht tacking off Lambay coming towards them. They said, oh, there's the boat with the guns, because no one had the least notion of what was going to happen. So when they reached Howth, they paraded, they marched up and down Harbour Road. What they were also doing was sealing off the pier, the East Wall Pier, which is the one that everybody goes out to now, over day trippers, if you like. And when they had that sealed off, the ship came in. It came in the way, the Asgard came in the way most boats come in, or ships come into Howth Harbour. It came in towards the West Pier. It actually would have passed under the commemorative plaque that was raised to commemorate the visit of King William IV 100 years earlier, almost to today as well. And then it swung around so that it was ready to leave again as soon as it had finished unloading. It swung around and it burst at the East Pier at full tide. It had to be all very carefully planned. They had to come in at the right moment, manoeuvre around and be ready to leave again. And then the whole pier was flooded with volunteers, and as we know, FINA boys actually unloaded the weapons because they had more familiarity with weapons and handling them, and were better trained and drilled than the adults. So they unloaded them, and then they were distributed amongst selected members of the company, because there were far more men there, probably about 1,000 men there, and there were 900 guns. The ammunition was also taken off. The ammunition was taken away first, which made sense. Some of it by motor car was driven out. The harbour master, Prothero was his name, when he heard what had happened, he tried to get across the harbour in a boat to intercept the unloading, and men pointed the guns at him, and his Coast Guard crew refused to go any further, so they took him back, but he was made of sterner stuff than they were. So he ran up then to the police barracks, the RIC barracks, which is still the Garda station in Howth, and dragged them down. And again, they faced this wall of men with guns, and the RIC quite sensibly said, there's nothing we can do. The volunteers had also cut the telegraph wires into Howth. So again, not to be defeated, Prothero got one of his men on a bike, and he cycled to Baldoyle, where there was still a functioning telegraph office, and sent the word in. That arrived in Dublin Castle, and William V. Howell, the assistant DMP commissioner, was there. Sir John Ross, the commissioner, wasn't around. He informed Sir James Doherty, the Under Secretary, the senior civil servant in the country at that moment, what was happening. Doherty summoned him to Dublin Castle, but Howell didn't turn up.
You mentioned in your book there was a marked difference in the politics between the two of them and how that affected things.
Yeah, you couldn't pick two more dissimilar figures. Both were Ulstermen, but Howell, his father, had also been commissioner of the police force before him. He was an Ulster Unionist, very strong Ulster Unionist. Doherty was one of that dying breed of liberal Presbyterian Ulstermen, and he was very much in tune with the liberal idea of home rule and Ireland for the Irish. So the two men didn't get on at all, and he got quite nervous when Harold didn't turn up for the meeting, understandably. What Harold did instead was he got together a scratch force of about 200 DMP and marched them out to meet the volunteers coming in from Howth, and he also asked for military assistance, which he probably had no right to do, certainly not without clearing it with the Under Secretary. So that set in play, unfortunately, the forgotten Bloody Sunday that day, because we all tend to remember the Howth Gun Running, but we don't remember so much the people who died or were seriously injured in the city itself.
And could the volunteer leadership have almost expected this to happen, that there would be such a brutal response from the soldiers or from the police?
Well, I don't think so. In fairness to them, it was done in broad daylight. I think they thought the audacity of it would carry it off, which it did eventually. But also they said, well, the Ulster Unionists have done it. And not only had they done it, they had actually imported more guns and ammunition since. But there had been a change in government policy. When the Lawn guns came in, the embargo was reimposed on arms importations, and weapons and firearms, ammunition and firearms were regularly intercepted on their way into Ireland for the Unionists. So they should have known, but I think there was an expectation, well, if the Unionists can do it, we have to, so the honour of the nation or the nationalist cause demands it. So I don't think they expected that. And even when they met Harold, and there was this sort of fairly light-hearted banter going on about, we're entitled to bring the guns in, and even as we speak, to roast the Unionist volunteers marching through the streets of Belfast on parade with guns. Why can't we do it? And our figures did offer to be, he said, I'll confess, I'll admit I'm responsible, you can arrest me. And the hope was, well, if you arrest a couple of us, and the rest of us can continue on the way, you save face, and we also get the guns. But Howell wasn't having any of that, and he ordered the first rank of DMP men forward to seize the guns. They made a half-hearted attempt, didn't get any, and stood back, and he ordered the second rank forward, and the second rank actually refused to move, at which point the King's Own Scottish Borderers had arrived, the troops he'd requested, who had been issued with live ammunition. And Brigadier Cuthbert, the senior officer in Dublin at the time, when he issued the instruction, he said, use force if necessary in support of the police, which was all in defiance of the defence, the army regulations, which actually did state that if you're acting in aid of the civil power, you still had to check that the civil power, whoever it was giving you lawful orders. So in other words, the fact that the DMP senior officer says shoot somebody doesn't mean you can shoot them. But they issued live ammunition, and the senior officer on the scene, Captain Cobden, actually told the men to load their magazines, so and fix their bayonets. So you had fully armed troops in Fairview ready to confront the volunteers when they arrived.
And although they had loaded weapons and bayonets, and although there were scuffles, they manifestly failed to seize the guns. Why did they fail to seize the guns?
Well, I think they failed because, for two reasons. One is there were so many volunteers. There were 158 Scottish Borderers, there were 200 police, but they were outnumbered at least 3 to 1 by the volunteers, just physically. The volunteers, when they'd marched out to Howth, every man had been issued with a baton, a long baton, wooden baton. So even men who didn't have rifles had the batons. So it was going to be a sort of punch-up. The odds were against the troops. And also these men had been, in fairness, drilling and training for some months at this stage. So they weren't just a group of civilians. And then the other reason, of course, is that the guns were being spirited away from the back. While Figgis was negotiating with Harrow, the guns were being taken away across the fields by the O'Brien Institute and Casino and Croydon Park. So when Harrow tweaked to that, a lot of the guns had gone. So it was really a scuffle about what was left. And there were sort of honours or even, really. There were 3 volunteers ended up in hospital, one of them with a serious bayonet wound. There were 2 Scottish Borderers ended up in hospital who shot themselves. One, we assume they shot themselves because there's no record of volunteers opening fire. One shot himself in the ankle, or a colleague shot him in the ankle, and the other one in the knee. So they lost 2 Lee Enfields in the scuffles as well. So they seized about 20 rifles. So and one Constable Cowes. The interesting thing about Constable Cowes is that he was hospitalised that day. In 1920, he was shot by the squad. He was acting as what they call a Buckshee detective for the G division of the DMP. So he was still active in 1920, but he was the other casualty that day.
And before we finish talking about the actual events of the day, we should talk, as you've kind of referred to already, about the shooting at Bachelor's Walk. So what happened in the city centre itself?
What happened was the soldiers obviously had been in a fairly bruising encounter and were probably a bit demoralised and jumpy as a result of that. They were marched back to the city. A mistake that was made and was acknowledged afterwards was that Harrow didn't supply a police escort. If he had have done that, at least there would have been police between the soldiers and the civilians. But as they marched back through Fairview, into North Strand, and down Talbot Street, into O'Connell Street, they were being increasingly jeered and heckled, and missiles started to be thrown. And by the time they got to O'Connell Street, they had one bayonet charging in North Strand. They made another one, more to scatter people than to inflict any hurt, in O'Connell Street, literally on the site of the Bloody Sunday of 1913, a year earlier. But once they got into Bachelor's Walk, the crowd gathered, was coming behind them, which makes sense. The crowd were not in front where they were advancing, and if they things did turn nasty, you'd be caught. So people were following them, jeering them, throwing orange peel, interestingly enough, symbolically enough, and then throwing stones. When they got into Bachelor's Walk, a new crowd appeared down Liffey Street. threatening their flank, as it were, and the crowd closed in, and a couple of soldiers were assaulted. One soldier was knocked unconscious with a flower pot that was thrown from above, and two soldiers were knocked to the ground, and men were trying to grab their rifles. So
they really knew how to have a good riot in Dublin.
Oh, they did. Modern Dublin is too soft, you know. Yeah. But anyway, the Captain Cobden, who'd been superseded by Major Haig, Captain Cobden did have to rescue physically one of the soldiers from the crowd, and Haig then, the new officer in charge, Major Haig, the senior battalion major, had come down from Collins Barracks, or Royal Barracks as it then was. He'd been told what was happening. He rushed down. He met them in Talbot Street. So he was in charge. He kept to the rear of the column, and he told off the last two sections to spread across the road and stop the crowd from following any further. He then checked the men and asked them, had they ammunition, and they said they had, and he said he was going to order them to fire, but he didn't actually order them to fire. What he did then was he stepped forward in front of the men, and obviously he hadn't the intention to open fire then, because he wouldn't stand in front of his own men, but he stood in front of the men. He raised his arm to call for silence from the crowd, and a stone or a missile of some sort hit him, or hit his hand. His hand came down, and maybe some of the soldiers took that as a signal. One of them fired, then there was a full volley, followed by a second, more ragged volley, and some soldiers continued firing. The army claimed only 31 rounds were fired, but there were at least 30 people, named people, in Jervis Street Hospital afterwards, and we know other people were shot, so there must have been more rounds fired. Only 3 people miraculously were killed outright. One other person died subsequently in September. But there were about at least 40 or 50 people seriously wounded by gunfire that day.
Now we're going to take a very quick break, and we'll be back with Pádraig Yeates. And we're back, and you're listening to the Irish History Show on Near FM. We're here with author and historian Pádraig Yeates. Pádraig, just before the break you talked there about the shootings on Bachelor's Walk. It does seem remarkable that a professional army in a capital city could just open fire on protesters.
Well, I suppose in fairness to the soldiers, they had been through this clash with the volunteers earlier. They're probably demoralised. In evidence to the inquest afterwards, Major Haig said 16 of his men, including himself and Cobden, the Captain Cobden, had been injured, scalp wounds and facial wounds from missiles. So they must have been fairly tense at that stage. And as they do, I suppose what was a key factor was the crowd were closing in on them. They weren't standing back, and they were now grappling with them and wrestling with soldiers to get their rifles off them. So they probably were quite nervous. Yes, I mean, it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary that Harold had called them out in the first place, and it was even more extraordinary that he allowed them to march through the city fully armed, without any police escort or supervision. And he paid the price. He was sacked the next day. The only senior police officer to be sacked by the British government in Ireland, certainly in Dublin, since the Act of Union. You know, he was very much seen as the main culprit there. The crowd was aggressive. The soldiers were young men, and the irony of it was, of course, that Dublin was a major recruiting centre for the British Army, and one of the key witnesses against the army was a former sergeant, British Army sergeant, who was in the crowd, and he said he didn't step back or retreat from the soldiers because he didn't think they were open fire. And he said, and he'd served in the South African War, he had 16 years service in the army. He said there was nothing to justify the shooting. Captain Cobden was actually accused of shooting Mary Duffy, the only woman who was killed. There were 2 men killed by a number of people, but the jury obviously didn't believe the people concerned. One of them was a young boy who, admittedly, he was actually standing behind her, so he couldn't actually see who shot her. And the only person who gave definite evidence, obviously, didn't come across very satisfactory way. But the army were deeply embarrassed. They tried to do what they could to not to actually sabotage the inquest, but to prevent military witnesses appearing. But of course they were in a predicament because they knew there was so much outrage, not just in Ireland but in Britain, at what had happened, that the British government, the Liberal government, weren't going to give cover to the army. So they were probably relieved that the war broke out, because the outbreak of the war meant that the whole thing was pretty well forgotten almost immediately.
I mean, we should get on to talk about the wider political consequences of the Howth Gun Running and so forth. But just one more point I'd like to make about the day itself. It strikes me how remarkably volatile and potentially violent street crowds in Dublin were at the time. I mean, you had ferocious rioting the year before in the Lockout, and equally ferocious by the police as by the strikers. I think it's fair to say. It doesn't seem to have been a big deal that the crowd would heckle soldiers and try to stone them and try to take their rifles off them. And Dublin seems to have been a really volatile place at the time.
Well, there was a lot of, Dublin was a violent place in that sense. It's sort of low-level violence, if you like. I remember as a kid in Gardiner Street on a Friday or Saturday night, there would be regular fights on the street where, men had a few drinks and it was time to settle scores, the rows that may have fled up in the previous week or may have been generational, may have gone back previous generations. But people resorted to violence fairly quickly at the time. It was fists and boots, it wasn't guns or anything, and it was all over fairly quickly. And once someone got knocked down, that was usually the end of it, or someone got a bloody nose, that was the end of it. But it was almost endemic, and if you look at DMP arrest records, assault is a very, very common offence, and drunkenness and assault.
It strikes me that when we're looking at this whole period that, that the Howth Gun Running and events around it and the Home Rule crisis were the start of, what we are starting to call now the revolutionary decade in Ireland. When we talk about the various riots that there were in Dublin and other cities, so there was riots between the police and crowds, there was riots between volunteers and crowds, people who had relations in the army, there was riots between the British Army and crowds and so forth. It strikes me that, like you said, that violence was a part of everyday life in those days, so maybe we shouldn't overthink sometimes this kind of rioting.
Yeah, no, I agree, John. I think it was. And rural Ireland was a fairly violent place as well. I mean, people slaughtered their own. If you wanted bacon for your breakfast, you killed your own pig and hung him up and slit his throat. So, we lived in a much more, in some ways, primitive or brutal society. In other ways, it was more civilized. But it was basically fairly bloody.
I wonder as well, possibly going off on a tangent here, but we were talking about militarism before. There was the idea also in those days of a fair fight, and that was a reasonable way to settle a difference. So it was a society which considered violence in a different way to us today, maybe.
Absolutely, and certainly a fight was a regular way. So if you lived in a working class area, you couldn't afford a lawyer even if you wanted one, and it was a regular way of sorting things out. And often it worked, at least temporarily. People shook hands, and it was over. And the DMP were themselves, as we know, very big men by and large. Sergeant Wolfe, the end man of the DMP tug of war squad, was about 7 foot. But a lot of them were big men, and it was that presence that helped maintain law and order. And of course, they were powerless once the gun came into play.
But actually, one very final, point on this is that, I think we saw in the Lockout the previous year, the great strike in Dublin, of course, that the authorities were quite willing to use lethal force sometimes. There were shots fired and swords and in Finglas during the Lockout. There were lethal baton charges in the city centre. So, I guess it may be all part of the same point that endemic violence was part of society, but the authorities seem to have been much more willing to use lethal force. And Bachelor's Walk, today the idea of an army fixing bayonets and being prepared to fire on a crowd would be extraordinary, but maybe not in those days.
Well, Bloody Sunday in Derry, it was a different situation, it was a riot situation, but there's no question that the parachute regiment were given sanction to take out anyone they wanted to, basically, and the 16 people they shot were ordinary demonstrators. They weren't gunmen. They were people there, on a civil rights march, asserting their right to freedom of assembly and being killed for it. So it's not some, okay, there had been a lot of rioting and other disturbances beforehand, but maybe it's not that far away that we think it is in any society. And say, looking at places like Ukraine, it's not that long ago that there were people protesting in Maidan Square. Now people are killing each other. I think these things often develop a momentum, but they're obviously fueled by deeper forces.
Well, there's such a stark difference between how the authorities react to Larne and how they react to Howth. Was that apparent to most people at the time? Did that generate an awful lot of anger among Irish nationalists throughout the country?
Oh, it did. Absolutely. It enraged Irish nationalists. It enraged quite a lot of British liberals as well, and Labour Party people, because of this double standard. There's no doubt about that. The Larne thing had not been anticipated. To some extent, obviously, people like Harold did anticipate what happened in the south, and were determined to stop it. He would probably have seen it, he was a unionist anyway, but he would have seen it as a defiance of law and order. He wouldn't have looked at it in a political sense of, we let the Ulster Unionists bring in some guns, so we better let the Nationalists bring in some guns. Whether the guns were of great military value is questionable, because the guns were quite obsolete. The ammunition for them was quite hard to get. So even the 2 million rounds that the Ulster Unionists brought in for their Vitrelli rifles, once they were used up, they couldn't be replaced. And the Howth Mausers were the same. They were very hard. It was very hard to get replacement ammunition for them. So, from a purely military point of view, they had very little significance. It was a symbolism. Having said that, of course, without them, Easter Rising would not have been possible in Dublin, because there just wouldn't have been enough other weapons to carry it out. So they were central from that point of view. And Kilcool, we shouldn't forget the guns that were brought in there. But interestingly enough, the Kilcool guns were brought in at night. They were brought in at midnight on August the 1st, and the Cowpea came in. It couldn't get onto the beach because it was a beach, wasn't a port as such. So local boats rowed out, and they unloaded the guns, got them into Kilcool, and then put them on motor transport. And the only incident was, I think, in Bray, where by then the DMP got some word, and they tried to hold up the convoy, but they were held at gunpoint, the DMP men, and they went through without any trouble.
How did the events of Bachelor's Walk affect the reputation of Scottish soldiers among Dublin people?
I don't know if it's affected that much, because there was this antipathy, between Scottish regiments and Scottish people generally, I suppose, whatever. Partly because of the orange thing, and it was often assumed if someone had a Scottish accent that they were orange men, basically. But certainly it did affect them. There are some reports that when they marched off the war, the crowds cheered, but I haven't been able to verify that anywhere. On the night it concerned, crowds did actually march up to the Royal Barracks, Collins Barracks today, and stood outside and jeered and challenged the soldiers to come out and fight. The soldiers were confined to barracks. One Scottish borderer did actually leave the barracks and ended up in the Liffey with his troubles. He went for a pint and he got more to drink than he bargained for. But there was a lot of anger there. The soldiers and the military authorities themselves tried to close down the inquest quickly because war was breaking out, and they said the troops had to get out of Dublin. But in fact, the Scottish borders didn't leave Dublin until the 15th of August. We know that because one of them, Sergeant Robert Kirkwood, was sued for breach of promise by a governess. He paid £100. He apparently wrote 370 gushing letters declaring his love, but when it came to the point, even though war was breaking out, he decided he'd rather stay in the army. But one of the officers, Captain Deering, actually did the reverse. He was due to get married in September, and he brought the wedding forward to August, and he got married to his bride on the 6th of August. So there were still soldiers, there were still Scottish borderers in Dublin up until the 15th of August, even though most other battalions had left at that stage. I should just say that Scottish borderers paid a very high price. No court could have punished them more severely than the German army did. They took part in the retreat from Mons, and by October they'd suffered 85% casualties between dead, missing, wounded and prisoners. So,
I think I read in one of the Workers' Republic issues, James Connolly had an article about a woman stopping a German soldier and saying, "How dare you, you awful brute, you're abusing civilians," and Connolly writes to the soldier, says, "No ma'am, you must have us confused with a King's Own Scottish borderer," in that way to show up the hypocrisy of people criticising German atrocities in Belgium.
Yeah, there was a song, a ditty, I can't remember it now, the King's Own Scottish borderers, where the song called them King's Own Scottish murderers. But there was a ditty in Dublin at the time about it, and it would have undoubtedly been attracted far more attention and had more consequences if Britain hadn't gone to war. We've got to remember that the shooting was on the 26th of July, the funerals were on the 28th of July. Even as the crowds were, thousands of people turned out for the funerals, including the son of Mary Duffy, Thomas Tye, who was a private in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. So you had this anomalous situation where you had one of the chief mourners was wearing a full dress uniform of the Dublin Fusiliers to mourn his mother who'd been shot by other members of the same army, and the guard of honour was provided by Irish volunteers carrying Holt's Mausers. But while all that was going on, the Austrian gunboats were shelling Belgrade, and the First World War was literally beginning that day on the Sava and the Danube rivers.
And the First World War obviously changed everything in Ireland, certainly in the short term. But just before we deal with that fallout, I've always wondered about Redmond. John Redmond had just managed to get himself co-opted and his allies co-opted onto the leadership, the executive of the Irish Volunteers. I always wondered, and we know he wasn't in on the Howth Gun Running, but what did he make of it? Wasn't really in a position to condemn it, but it wasn't really his type of operation. So what did he make of it? Do we know?
We don't, or at least I don't. But I think events happened so quickly because by August the 4th, Britain was at war with Germany, and as we know famously, both Carson and Redmond pledged support to the war effort. So that really refocused everyone's attention. Interestingly enough, Carson gave initially more conditional support. He said they were supporting Britain in the war. They were not supporting the British government in his speech in the Commons, whereas Redmond made a much more fulsome commitment, although he didn't actually say that he supported sending troops to Europe. He didn't urge conscription or anything like that, but it was a much more full-blooded commitment to the war. So I think that literally the outbreak of the war changed everything within literally a matter of a couple of days.
It must have seemed like good timing for Redmond at the time.
Yes.
We know in hindsight it was bad, of course, but
oh, it did, as you say, John, it changed everything.
But it must have been very uncomfortable for some Irish Party supporters, especially in Dublin, to be supporting the British war effort in the wake of Bachelor's Walk.
Well, certainly the Dublin Corporation meeting, the one that was held immediately after Bachelor's Walk, the war didn't get a mention. It was all about the massacre, and even unionist councillors, and there were quite a few of them, didn't attempt to defend it. Everybody condemned it. But in fact, it was one of these schizophrenic things. If you look at the records of Dublin Corporation during the war, I can only recollect one reference to the war, and it was a vote of condolences to Sir Thomas Edmund on the death of one of his sons on a warship which took part in the Battle of Jutland. I can't remember the name of the warship, but it manages to avoid mentioning the battle. It just says he died on this warship. And that's the nearest they ever came to discussing the war. As a war, they did discuss the hardship and the problems it caused, and that did erode nationalist support. But the war was never really debated formally in Dublin, whether it was a good or a bad thing, whether Britain was losing or winning it.
I mean, in terms of radical nationalists, they were really happy, kind of paradoxically, with the events of the Howth Gun Running and Bachelor's Walk. I mean, Sean McDermott actually wrote to America, to Joe McGarty in Clonmacnoise, saying, this will open the eyes of the fools as to what liberal government is. So that, it's the idea of you unmask the true face of the oppressor. And then, though, they were, the First World War broke out weeks later, and they were absolutely crestfallen with the reaction. So the reaction on the ground does seem to have been, initially, quite pro-British and pro-war. I mean, Joe O'Connor, who was IRB Volunteers and later on IRA, wrote that, the inconstancy of the average person was sickening. That, 1 week they were out, like you said, trying to beat the behinds of the Scottish borderers, like rioting in the streets with them and waving rebel flags and shouting rebel slogans, and the next week they were out with Union Jacks, or that was his perception. So this really seemed to have been a very volatile public opinion at the time.
I would say a lot of it was very superficial. I mean, obviously the IRB attitude was a traditional revolutionary one. The worse things get, the better, because that's the only way you're going to bring down the system. So they would be fomenting that. But when the war broke out, once Redmond, the Irish Party, we shouldn't forget, still had this huge hegemony in Irish politics in the south, at least, and in parts of the north as well. And they could tell, if John Redmond said, the war was a good thing, or at least our participation is a good thing, people supported that, and they bought into the notion, some of them, that by common sacrifice, fighting the Germans, nationalists and unionists would come together, and that was Redmond's naive hope. It's only as time goes by and the war settles down and the hardships begin that people begin to reassess themselves. But still, there's relatively little recruitment here compared with Britain. There was a more limited war fever outside of Belfast. Even in Belfast, the recruiting rates were a bit lower than they were in Britain. So, there was always that reservation amongst a lot of people. Desertion and absenteeism became huge problems. I'm sure they were in other cities as well, but Dublin had the added problem that a lot of British deserters would come here in the naive belief that it somehow protected them from being called back. But all those men coming back from the front who were deserting, who were on the run, were obviously telling people it's not nice out there, and whatever you do, don't join the British Army. So that's a fact that we tend to forget. But those things are so commonplace at the time, people hardly remarked on them. I've seen cases of the DMP arresting people for harbouring deserters, and the penalties could be quite severe. In fact, the penalties for doing things like that were more severe than militant nationalists being arrested for unlawful assembly or illegal possession of guns. The British were far more worried about the number of men leaving the British Army and going on the run than they were about Republicans going on the run. So, it was only, in hindsight, it was only after 16 that priorities were reorganised. But looking at it, the British almost sleepwalked into, we use that term now about the Great War, but sleepwalked into the Rising as well, totally misjudged the situation.
I mean, we've talked about the weapons imported at Howth, and that they were obsolete. They were single-shot weapons, and they certainly wouldn't have been up to combat on the Western Front or the Eastern Front in the First World War. But and with hindsight, though, I mean, the fallout, and of course, most of the weapons ended up with the more radical volunteers, because of course the volunteers split over the war. It does seem amazing in hindsight that even having tried with force to prevent them landing the weapons, that they allowed the volunteers and the Citizen Army to parade openly in Dublin and elsewhere, actually, with weapons. But as you said, it was the policy of the Chief Secretary and the Under Secretary at the time that it would do more harm than good to disarm them.
Yeah, it was a judgment call, and maybe it was right, maybe it was wrong, we don't know. You've got to remember that the volunteers, even amongst the militants, there were divisions. MacNeill wanted to hold on to the guns, but not to provoke the British or not to have a rising, unless they tried to introduce conscription. His argument, which was a good one, was that if they try and introduce conscription, we'll have massive support, and then people will rally to us, and we will fight. Whereas the insurrectionists were afraid the war would end before they had an opportunity to fight, including Connolly, of course, some of whose language was every bit as bloodthirsty as Pearse or the rest of them, and who had bought into this whole idea of sacrifice as well. So they were fighting for the soul of a nation. It wasn't really, there were economic arguments made and so on about why Ireland should be free, but basically they were afraid that Anglicisation had reached a point in Ireland that we'd soon be no different from the English or the Scots or the Welsh, and we'd all be happy members of the United Kingdom. So it was very much a fight for the soul of the nation that they were engaged in, and the gun was a symbol of that. I think people like Nathan understood that. The Under Secretary who replaced Doherty understood that, and in fact, during the lead up to 1916, there was a very bitter dispute in the City of Dublin Steamship Company. And ironically enough, the Transport Union executive, their relations with James Connolly became very strained because he wanted to use the guns of the Citizen Army to hand them out to the strikers at one point. Not the Citizen Army men wanted to do that because they'd been paying to buy these guns and didn't want some yahoo running off with them. But ironically enough, the Transport executive were afraid that the presence of the Citizen Army would lead the British to suppress the Union. Nathan was actually telling the employees he wasn't going to get involved in smashing the strike because of the existence of the Citizen Army, and that if he went and raided Liberty Hall, it could cause a confrontation with the Citizen Army and an outbreak of violence. The argument was contain it. So long as they're not actually out killing people, let them play their game of soldiers.
One of the great cliches of Irish history is the moment the gun entered Irish politics. Was the Howth running the day the gun entered Irish politics?
Well, I think most people blame Edward Carson for that, and I think they're right. The Howth Gun Running was very much, I think, and the volunteers a consequence of the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, and that's what brought the gun back in the 20th century.
Well, thank you very much, Pádraig. That was a very interesting discussion. If you'd like to listen to this or any previous episode of the show, you can go to the Near FM podcast page on nearfm.ie/podcast, or check out our Facebook page on facebook.com/The Irish History Show. We're on Twitter, on twitter.com/Irish History Pod, and you can also email us at history@near.ie. On behalf of my co-presenter, John Dorney from theirishstory.com, and myself, Cathal Brennan, thank you very much for listening to the show.